We don't know really any of our prime ministers, and I think that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. There's only about 4 provinces in Canada that require a high school course in history. Our institutions have abdicated Canadian history. Library and Archives Canada, they get funding cuts. They've buried a lot of their political history. So we don't do a good job of preserving, promoting, and telling our stories. So no wonder kids don't pick up history. We've kind of failed ourselves as a nation in terms of trying to teach Canadian history.
At their best, prime ministers set a tone of civility and unity. They govern for all Canadians. They make fundamental change by lifting up the country or shaking it to its roots. They leave Canada better than they found it. The words of 2 eminent Canadian historians and Carleton University professors, Stephen Azzi and Norman Hilmer. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. The job of Prime Minister is grueling. The pace is frenetic. The pressure is unrelenting. To survive the office requires steadfastness, stamina, resilience, and an unusually thick skin. While it may be the most coveted position in Canada, it's arguably the most burdensome and least understood. Indeed, many Canadians know very little historically about who the nation's prime ministers were and why they still matter. Canada's prime ministers have been visionaries, philosophers, pragmatic operators, and technocrats. They've been charmers and loners. They've been affable, mercurial, avuncular, and enigmatic. They've had ambition, been patient, compassionate, and ruthless. They've inspired with their words and deeds. They've underwhelmed with their fecklessness, indecision, hubris, and greed. Successful prime ministers have at times galvanized the population and captured the national mood. They've understood when to recruit talent into their cabinets and how to delegate power. They've been thieves, stealing the best ideas from the platforms of their opponents, and agile, wily navigators of turbulent political waters. In every generation, Canadians have looked to their prime ministers for strength and reassurance in times of crisis when they face trauma, tragedy, and existential threats. Some have risen to the occasion, others have withered under the intense scrutiny and come undone. Few Canadians know the stories of the country's prime ministers better than J.D.M. Stewart. The acclaimed educator and historian's first book was called Being Prime Minister. His most recent effort is a sweeping account of Canada's 24 prime ministers, from John A. Macdonald, a Scottish-born immigrant, to Mark Carney, a native of Fort Smith, Northwest Territories. The book is entitled The Prime Ministers, Canada's Leaders and the Nation They Shaped. J.D.M. Stewart, welcome to In Bed with the Elephant.
It's great to be with you, Adrian.
James, I just want to read you this quote, and it's by Lester B. Pearson from 1964, and he says, "Prime ministers require the hide of a rhinoceros, the morals of St. Francis, the patience of Job, the wisdom of Solomon, the strength of Hercules, the leadership of Napoleon, the magnetism of a beetle, and the subtlety of Machiavelli." What does that quote mean to you?
Well, it certainly tells us about how impossible a job it is to be prime minister, how tough it is from so many different angles. I think every prime minister from Sir John A. Macdonald to Mark Carney would talk about the challenges of the job. And it's a difficult country to govern to begin with all of its regional differences and historical challenges. But the interesting thing is, in spite of how Pearson lays that out with all of the challenges, they all love being prime minister, and they wouldn't give that job up for anything. So there's a bit of irony to that, I would say.
We talk a lot about prime ministers in this country, it seems, and yet in your book, you're making the argument that we seem to forget about them as well. So how do you square that?
Well, I think we talk about the prime ministers in the sense of the one who's in office and maybe the one who immediately preceded the person in office, but we don't really talk a lot about prime ministers from a historical perspective. You don't often see a lot of references to previous prime ministers. And I know it was interesting when Mark Carney gave that speech in Quebec City earlier this year, and I was listening to it, and he rhymed off about 6 or 7 names of former prime ministers. I was quite stunned and pleased to hear him do that. But it doesn't happen very often. We don't have this tradition of reaching back like the Americans to Lincoln or Washington or Reagan, whoever the case may be. In Canada, you very rarely hear the name Wilfrid Laurier invoked, or even Canada's longest-serving Prime Minister, William Lyon Mackenzie King. You don't hear that invoked as part of a Prime Minister's rhetoric or in an article in the newspaper or something. So we talk about Prime Ministers, the ones in office, the current ones, the ones we remember, but we don't dig into our history to recall their examples or their words.
That tribute will sink deeply into the hearts of the Canadian people. I am especially grateful, speaking in the name of my fellow countrymen, that you have paid special tribute to those whose names will be for all time associated with the place in which we stand today.
By their heroic achievements upon the battlefields of France and Flanders, made for our dominion a place amongst the nations of the world. They are now engaged in a struggle for the agricultural and industrial development of their country.
We Canadians of French descent are not a little proud of our precedence as pioneers in opening up the lands and rivers of the half-continent which has become Canada.
The representative of the USSR, why do you oppose effective inspection? If you have nothing to hide, why hide it? And I think in general that represents the thinking of free men everywhere.
The honor I have received today, which is for my country even more than for me, confirms my own desire and my own resolve to do everything I can to maintain and strengthen these good relations with the country which, now more than ever that I am a freeman of this city, will always be my second home.
Why is it important? Because we know that in the last 30 years, there's been a movement to tell the history from below and to kind of not engage as much, perhaps, with the history from, quote unquote, above. Why is it important to know about prime ministers? Why do prime ministers matter?
Prime ministers matter because leadership matters. And at the end of the day, the prime minister is at the head of the government that is making decisions that affect all Canadians. So the history from below that you talk about is impacted by the decisions made by the leaders of the country. I quote Peter C. Newman in my book, where he said, "An hour in the office of the prime minister is an hour in the history of the country." And I think it was true when Peter C. Newman wrote it in the 1960s, and it's true today. You know, if you look at some of the decisions being made by Mark Carney right now, the speech that he gave in Davos that's been quoted so often, his decisions on removing the carbon tax, his decisions on signing an MOU with Alberta, with pivoting from the United States in our trade policy. These are decisions that the Prime Minister has made, his government, but they're also decisions that affect Canadians. And of course, that has happened throughout Canadian history. So leadership matters, and it matters in government, it matters in business, it matters in the world of sports. So we should never forget the importance of leadership. And I certainly agree with you that history, you know, the social history, the history from below, I think is essential, and that's where some of the best stories are. And we should never just tell only the history of leadership or only the history of prime ministers. We have to have a balanced approach to teaching history, and that certainly includes leadership, but it also includes the experiences of ordinary Canadians living their lives.
Has the way we evaluate and measure prime ministers changed over the decades? The criteria that a historian like yourself uses to assess a prime minister, has that evolved over time?
What we do now is, I'd say, we scrutinize more, and we are more inclusive in the issues that we use to evaluate a prime minister. We didn't in the past take a look at how a prime minister handled environmental policy or Indigenous policy. But we certainly look at those things now. A lot changed in the early 2000s when the Truth and Reconciliation process began, and Prime Minister Stephen Harper apologized on behalf of all Canadians for the residential school system in 2008. A big historical moment. Here's a prime minister standing up in the House of Commons and atoning for the treatment of Indigenous peoples since Confederation. One of the big planks of evaluating a prime minister's legacy is how did they handle the Indigenous policy.
Let's go to those prime ministers. Let's talk about who they were and their record. So let's first begin with Sir John A. Macdonald. Born in Scotland, a father of Confederation. What kind of prime minister was Sir John A?
Well, he was one of our most visionary prime ministers who had a vision to make a country that would stretch from sea to sea. He was bullish on the prospects for a country north of the United States. He wanted to resist the incursion of Americans into British North America. And he was a man who could rally people to a cause. He was a charismatic person and a strong stump speaker. But he's also controversial. But more controversial really in the last 20 years or so, really, as Truth and Reconciliation was gaining traction, Macdonald became the avatar for our mistreatment of Indigenous peoples. So Macdonald has a mixed legacy, but there wouldn't be a Canada without Sir John A. Macdonald. And we know that there are things that Macdonald did that we wouldn't support today, but his lasting monument really is the Dominion of Canada itself, the country that we live in.
You know, Tanya Talaga, the award-winning Anishinaabe writer, former Massey lecturer, journalist, author of Seven Fallen Feathers, has said, Sir John A. Macdonald should not be revered or celebrated. Tell the truth about Canada and its founders. How do you respond to that comment that Tanya Talaga makes about Sir John A.?
I listen to what Tanya Talaga and other Indigenous people say for sure, and I think their perspective is obviously valid. But I think what's happened in the discussion about Sir John A. Macdonald is that it has come to revolve around only one issue. And the legacy of a prime minister who served for 16 plus years and had his tentacles in many aspects of the nation is going to be about more than just his largely failed Indigenous policy. The legacy of Macdonald is complex and mixed, much like the nature of history is complex and mixed. And so I would caution anyone from taking just a singular view of any person, including historical figures.
Were his policies genocidal to you?
To me, no, I don't think they were.
Why not?
If people want to say that it was a cultural genocide, we might be able to make that argument that Macdonald was involved in an aggressive assimilation policy. But Macdonald wasn't trying to rid Canada and exterminate the population of Indigenous peoples. That's not the kind of person he was. His policies weren't directed towards that either. And if he was trying to get rid of all Indigenous people, why was he friends with many of them?
But he was engaging in another kind of erasure, was he not? Like he was trying to get rid, for example, of the tribal system. During his tenure, Indigenous people became wards of the Canadian state. He banned Indigenous cultural ceremonies, banned the potluck, he banned the Sundance. That was about erasing the story of Indigenous peoples, was it not?
I would refer to that as policies of aggressive assimilation, which weren't really out of touch with the way other Indigenous peoples were being treated in the Western world. It's not how we would treat Indigenous peoples today, and thankfully so. But remember that this is not the only thing that Macdonald was trying to do. As I said before, he's trying to give Indigenous people the right to vote. So his policy is not one that we revere him for. It's something that we criticize him for.
Does he deserve a statue in the middle of Montreal? There's a statue that was erected in Montreal in the 1890s, and that statue was toppled, I believe, in 2020 by those people who felt that, honoring Sir John A. Macdonald was an abomination, given the fact that he was responsible for a genocidal project, an assimilative project that also involved, for example, the weaponization of food on the plains of Western Canada.
Well, I think that Macdonald does deserve a statue. A lot of the statues have been put away. The one in Montreal has been put away, and there's just an empty plinth there. But I think we have to consider that Macdonald was one of the important leaders who brought about the Dominion of Canada. Canada has made mistakes over the course of its history, but it also has relied on the leadership of people in order to make it the country that it is today. And I don't know that the example of Macdonald is one that deserves to be toppling a statue. We have to remember that the way we feel about Indigenous people today in 2026 is we are regretful for the way that Indigenous people have been treated, and we wouldn't do it the way Macdonald did. But Macdonald was also the person who made the Dominion of Canada and built a railway out to the west. So I think we've got to consider the whole totality of a prime minister's record.
Even in your book, you mention the name Dr. Peter Bryce, And Dr. Peter Bryce was the chief medical officer of the Department of, I think it was Health in the government. And he was a whistleblower. He was someone who was mortified by the way in which the state, the Canadian state, was dealing with, was mistreating with Indigenous peoples. He was mortified by, for example, the residential school system as well. And he called it out in that time, like in the early 1900s. You know, there's often an argument made that these figures like Sir John A., they were people of their time. But even within that time, there were people who knew that some of the things that were being done were immoral.
Yes. So Peter Bryce gave his report to the Laurier government. And this is one of the interesting things when I said earlier that Macdonald is the avatar and takes the heat for all of the treatment of Indigenous peoples in all of Canadian history. But here, during the Laurier years, the Laurier government was presented with this report that talked about how terrible the conditions were in residential schools. But the Laurier government responded very weakly to that report. They just changed a few ventilation systems and didn't really address the significant problems with tuberculosis and other food conditions and ventilation conditions. So this is just another example of the Canadian government turning a blind eye to the plight of Indigenous people. And it's not just Sir John A. Macdonald.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Sir Wilfrid Laurier, because Laurier was really quite a remarkable individual. He becomes really the first French Canadian to lead the country. But one thing that I found interesting about Laurier, and I hadn't realized this, is for the first 18 of his first 22 years in office, as an MP, he was in opposition. He only becomes leader of the Liberal Party in 1887, and it takes him 9 years to get power.
He is also, I believe, still the longest-serving member of Parliament in Canadian history. Laurier, I think, is another one of our great prime ministers and believed in the nation. He inspired the country with his rhetoric as well. Lofty oratory where he said that Canada has been the inspiration of my life. He said, let your motto be Canada first, Canada last, Canada always. And so he inspired us with his words. But he also has things that we can be critical of in his time in office. It's just that we don't seem to talk about them as much in Canadian history as we do with some of Sir John A. Macdonald's failings. But I certainly think he is a prime minister who laid down a template that a lot of subsequent prime ministers would be wise to follow.
What were some of the kind of main challenges that he faced during his tenure?
First of all, he was the first Francophone prime minister in Canadian history. There's a lot of pressure on a prime minister. If you're early in Confederation, he became prime minister in 1896. So it's 30 years into the Canadian project. And for the first time, you have a French-speaking Quebecer at the helm. So there would have been enormous pressure on him. For example, if he had turned out to be a bust, maybe people would have thought, why are we electing Quebecers? He faced the issue at the turn of the century of trying to balance Canadian independence or growing autonomy with its relationship with the British Empire. So there was the South African War at the turn of the century where Laurier had to balance how do we respond to the empire, but whereas Quebec nationalists would be reticent to join an imperial conflict, so he worked out a compromise with that. He also faced the challenges of growing the country, and so he had a massive immigration policy that brought millions of people into Canada during his 15 years in office. So there was a lot of expansion in the West where Saskatchewan joined Confederation, Alberta joined Confederation in 1905. And at the same time, though, this is where some of the criticism of Laurier is, the government was expropriating land from Indigenous people. So there's a bit of the mixed record of Laurier, but certainly someone who is trying to make Canada feel that it had a promising future.
Laurier is consistently ranked as being one of the best prime ministers that this country has produced. Another person who's consistently seen as being one of the top prime ministers in the country's history is William Lyon Mackenzie King, who was not as beloved as Laurier, who didn't have the kind of charisma and the personality, wasn't as affable as a Laurier, and yet, managed to lead this country for some 22 years. What was the kind of quality that allowed William Lyon Mackenzie King to be as successful as he was as a prime minister?
It's a good question, and Mackenzie King still is a bit of an enigma to Canadians and Canadian historians, but you're right, he does often get ranked as one of our top prime ministers, if not number one. He had incredible political antennae and would know just how far he could push something before he needed to retreat. He was able to handle difficult files by maybe pushing things down a road a bit. For an example, with the issue of conscription during the Second World War, Mackenzie King knew how divisive it had been under Robert Borden in the First World War, and he made a promise that he would not bring in conscription. But then as the war progressed, it became apparent that Canada probably needed to bring in conscription. So rather than just bringing it in right away, what Mackenzie King did was he had a plebiscite asking the Canadian people if they would release the government from the promise that he had made. And the voting public agreed to release the Canadian government from the promise. English Canada voted very heavily in favor of releasing the government, and French Canada voted very heavily in favor of not releasing the government. But at least it gave people a chance to have their voices heard. And then down the road, conscription did come in, but he was able to diffuse the tensions there. He was also very smart to have a strong Quebec lieutenant in his cabinet, Ernest Lapointe, who served in that role. Mackenzie King knew how to bring in strong talent with him. For example, at the beginning of this conscription crisis, I think it was in 1941, he said, I need to bring in a man named Louis Saint-Laurent to be my justice minister. He was a Quebec lawyer at the time. So he could recruit talent. And Mackenzie King would also shave off some of the policy ideas from the political left and bring it into his Liberal government's platform. So just a wily politician who could navigate the political waters quite successfully. And there's a really good political cartoon that I used to use in my teaching career. It was a picture of Mackenzie King in rough waters, but handling the rapids in his canoe by just being agile.
And speak about that agility with regard to his administration, I suppose, of government during the Second World War. What kind of wartime leader was he?
In terms of his rhetoric or oratory or galvanizing the nation, he wasn't a Churchill or a Roosevelt. But he was very cognizant of Canadian autonomy. He made certain that there was a debate in Parliament about going to war in 1939. He significantly was behind the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, which trained airmen from around the Commonwealth to participate in the war in various air forces. So he was always keeping in mind that Canada's voice would be heard, but his mindset was always on positioning Canada to respond strongly to the Nazi menace and to play a good military role on the continent, which it did.
One of the things that makes being a prime minister so difficult is that there really is no playbook. There's no real blueprint. You are effectively a prisoner of the events of your time. One thinks of Sir Robert Borden, who during his tenure, has to deal with the First World War, has to deal, for example, with a pandemic, has to deal with the Halifax explosion of 1917. But I'm thinking particularly of someone like R.B. Bennett, who is elected really at the wrong time in history. He's elected in the middle of the greatest depression that the world had seen, and the kind of effect that would have on his tenure. Can you just kind of address that challenge of being a prisoner of your time?
That's the thing in politics, right? What was it, Harold Macmillan, who said, events, old boy, events, that's what we have to be concerned about, because you just never know what's going to happen. And R.B. Bennett had the misfortune of becoming prime minister when we were in the deepest economic slump of the Great Depression. He was elected in 1930 and had a tough time for five years trying to be prime minister. And then he got voted out in 1935, not surprisingly, which is when Mackenzie King took over. But circumstances, politics a lot of it is about timing. And Mark Carney is prime minister during an extremely difficult time right now. If you think about when Pierre Trudeau, towards the end of his time in office, where the economy tanked in the early 1980s, that was a challenge. Or even Stephen Harper. He became prime minister in 2006, But then in 2008, we had the economic meltdown, and that just put a spanner in all of his economic plans, because it's not really expected that a conservative prime minister is going to borrow billions and billions of dollars to prop up Canadians and the economy during this economic meltdown of 2008. So circumstances are always a challenge. And as you said, there is no playbook. And so I think sometimes you have to rely on your instincts, and also rely on some of the principles that I think other prime ministers have laid down, such as I think pragmatism is one of the most important skills for a prime minister to have, and teamwork and consultation with your provinces. There's a lot of things you can do, but circumstances are often going to tie your hands.
I wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening to In Bed with the Elephant. If you can, please follow us in the app that you're using. If you already follow us, thank you. And please do take the time to leave a rating or a review. It helps to get more people listening to our show. And please keep spreading the word about us to your networks. In a world drowning in misinformation and disinformation, never has the work of journalists been more important. That's why we here at In Bed with the Elephant are so grateful to our podcast's founding sponsor, Perfect Books, for their support of independent journalism. James, can you tell us about one book that's on your radar that you'd like to share with our audience?
We talked a little bit today, Adrian, about William Lyon Mackenzie King. And just last year, there was a book published by UBC Press called The Enduring Riddle of Mackenzie King. And that was edited by Patrice Dutil. And it is a collection of essays by a lot of great historians from Canada evaluating the history of the Mackenzie King years.
Perfect Books is an independent bookstore located at 258A Elgin Street in the heart of downtown Ottawa. Perfect Books, a store for book lovers. One of the revelations of your book, I would say, for me, was Louis Saint Laurent, who you refer to as being, a forgotten prime minister, that a lot of people don't seem to remember him, remember his contribution to the country, in the late 1940s and 1950s. And yet the picture you paint is of someone who was enormously gifted as a leader, someone who seemed to have empathy, someone who others wanted to follow and that commanded the respect of the people around him. Can you tell us a little bit more about Louis Saint Laurent and what made him, to you, such a special prime minister?
So he was a very efficient prime minister and well-liked. I did a bit more investigation on him and realized that he was responsible for a number of great infrastructure projects in Canada, the Trans-Canada Highway, for example, the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Distant Early Warning Line in the Arctic. And he also increased defense spending by a considerable percentage during his time in office. There was a story in my book that I tell about him finishing a long day at the office, and he went out to the elevator to leave Parliament, and the elevator operator was there, and the Prime Minister, Louis Saint Laurent, said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And the elevator operator said, "Well, I always stay until you leave, Prime Minister." He says, "Listen, from now on, you go home with everybody else at the end of the day. I can get myself down this elevator quite easily, so thanks very much." He was known as Uncle Louis because he had this avuncular nature, and people enjoyed working for him. He always knew his cabinet brief as well as any other cabinet minister, so you needed to come to your cabinet meetings prepared. And he had a bit of a CEO demeanor about the way he carried himself in office. And there's a funny story about the election of John Diefenbaker, and I guess a partisan Liberal said, Louis Saint Laurent made the job of prime minister look so easy that Canadians thought anybody could do it. So they elected John Diefenbaker.
Well, you also talk about Louis Saint Laurent as being one of the country's premier foreign policy prime ministers. Why so?
Well, even before he became prime minister, he gave this famous Gray lecture at the University of Toronto in 1947, I think it was. And that laid out the principles of Canadian foreign policy, that it would be values-based, that they would defend freedom where they needed to, et cetera. He laid out 5 principles. But remember, Louis Saint Laurent was the prime minister who got Canada fought during the United Nations mission, the Korean War. He was responsible for increasing Canada's presence in Europe in the post-war era. He was a Cold War prime minister who understood the importance of a strong defense as part of a foreign policy. And he was the prime minister during the 1956 Suez Crisis when Lester B. Pearson, as external affairs minister, won the Nobel Prize for Peace. So Saint Laurent was also sort of pivoting Canada away from its relationship with the United Kingdom and trying to exert a bit more Canadian sovereignty. So it was a very tumultuous time during Louis Saint Laurent's time as prime minister, and he navigated those foreign affair waters very carefully. And one last thing I'll say is that he was the prime minister when Canada signed on to NATO in 1949.
In Canada, an upset election ousted Prime Minister Saint Laurent and his Liberal government and installed the Conservative regime of John Diefenbaker by a narrow margin to deal with Canada's expanding economy and industry.
You know, you're quite critical of John Diefenbaker, as a number of Canadian historians are. You know, John Diefenbaker, has been seen as being rather erratic, as kind of lacking the kind of temperament that one would expect of a prime minister. John Diefenbaker, famously defeats Louis Saint Laurent and later goes on to win one of the famous victories in Canadian political history, in which he wins, a landslide. But, Bob Plamondon, the biographer of John Diefenbaker, actually says that Diefenbaker is kind of not given his due as a prime minister and that there's been a failure of historians to recognize his accomplishments during his 6 years in office. Would you, does the argument of Bob Plamondon have any merit?
Of course there's merit in Bob's argument, and I think that's the nature of history. There is not just one version of history, and there's multiple ways to look at the legacy of a prime minister, whether it is Sir John A. Macdonald, R.B. Bennett, or John Diefenbaker in this case. So a case can be made for looking at Diefenbaker in a different light. My argument is that his relationship with the United States was not great. I don't think he was a manager of his cabinet. I don't think he managed it very strongly. They were often in disarray. He had difficulty making decisions. He would prevaricate and just take too long to make decisions. His record is not without accomplishment, though. He signed Canada onto NORAD. He had a vision for the North. He appointed the first Indigenous person to be a senator. He gave Indigenous people the right to vote in 1960. So he has a record. But all these things are up for debate in history, and I think this is one of the things that it would be better for us as a country to do, is to be able to hold two ideas in our head at the same time, or two arguments in our head at the same time, because that is the nature of history. It's an alive thing, and there are different arguments, and many of those arguments hold weight. It may not be the thing that you agree with, but that's why we have a discussion.
One of the more successful prime ministers in Canadian history, you believe, is Lester Pearson. And yet Lester Pearson only served as prime minister for some 5 years. What made those 5 years so successful?
Well, it is pretty remarkable. I think every time people go back and think about Lester B. Pearson, they don't understand how in 5 years he was able to bring in a national pension system, a national health care system, and a new Canadian flag. Any one of those things is a remarkable achievement for a 5-year period in office. But Pearson was able to do all of those things in his 5 years. And as well, he hosted the 1967 centennial celebrations and was very busy welcoming a lot of foreign dignitaries. He did it through some of his diplomacy, which he was able to use because remember, the other thing is, all of his governments were minority governments, which I think most Canadians, if they know anything about Pearson, they would know that when he was doing these things, it was with a minority government. But perhaps there was also a sense of commonality in the House of Commons at that time, a sense of trying to get things done. And Pearson was not a polarizer, although the flag was a polarizing issue. So it was a bit of alchemy there. Pearson is not without his weaknesses either, because he had a number of difficulties during his 5 years in office, but it is a remarkable set of achievements. And I think he was also a very likable fellow, and that helps to get things done in relationships. And maybe it also helps in the way people remember you in history.
I think you also suggest that he wasn't afraid of sharing power, and he wasn't afraid of delegating. He recognized the need to bring in some other pieces into his government and into his caucus. He brought in Jean Marchand. He brought in Gérard Pelletier, the journalist, and he also brought in Pierre Trudeau into his government. And by doing that, he really helped to change the course of Canadian history.
He did. And, Pearson had a lot of foresight, because this was a period where a lot of Quebec nationalism,
Jean Lesage's Quiet Revolution, yeah.
That's right. He saw all of this coming. And, he started the Bilingualism and Biculturalism Commission. So he began our need to pay attention to these Quebec issues and brought in those 3 Quebec candidates who then won election, and one of them, of course, being Pierre Trudeau. There is a great photo, if people look for it online. In a single shot, there is a picture of Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson with 3 cabinet ministers. One is Pierre Trudeau, one is Jean Chrétien, and the third is John Turner. So a picture with 1 prime minister and 3 future prime ministers. It's quite a remarkable photo.
And you've referenced the flag as being one of his greatest accomplishments. And in fact, in the book, you say that is his greatest accomplishment. For people of this time, that might seem a little bit odd. They'd wonder, why was the flag such an accomplishment? Why was that so important?
So it's another one of those things where people living today wouldn't understand about the way Canada was different in the 1960s. And there was a very large section of the population who still felt a great affinity for the British Empire. So getting a new Canadian flag was, for some people, like turning our back on Canadian history. So it was a very difficult thing to do. But Pearson believed in it, and he knew that Canada needed a flag that was emblematic of its own future without the vestiges of the past attached to it. But that flag was hard to get through. It was very, there's more debates on the flag issue than almost anyone in Canadian parliamentary history. When the flag was raised in February of 1965, Diefenbaker cried. I'm sure some other Canadians did too. So this was a courageous and bold move, because it wasn't necessarily a slam dunk. When he announced his intentions to bring in a new flag, he was booed. So this took a lot of courage. And of course, looking back now, when everybody loves the Canadian flag, it almost seems impossible that we even had a great debate about it. But that's why we have to go into our history books and see what things were like at the time. But thankfully for us, he did, because I think we have one of the greatest flags in the world.
And here is the greatest liberal of them all, the Prime Minister-elect, the Right Honourable Pierre Elliott Trudeau.
Fellow Canadians, mes chers amis canadiens, well, welcome to the 1980s.
In terms of just, the kind of success that a prime minister has, a lot of it depends on luck. And you point to the fact that Pierre Trudeau was the beneficiary of having a second act. Like, for example, Sir John A. Macdonald had a second act. William Lyon Mackenzie King also had a second act. But Trudeau's act, arguably, is probably the most important act of a prime minister in Canadian history. Can you tell us a little bit about how that occurred?
In 1979, the Trudeau Liberals lost election to Joe Clark's Progressive Conservatives. So that's the end of Trudeau, presumably after 11 years in office, with some achievements such as official bilingualism, the omnibus bill, some environmental legislation, but not much else. And Trudeau basically decides he's not going to run again. But he gets talked into it and decides in 1980 that he will, when the Joe Clark government falls, Trudeau decides he'll come back. And he wins the 1980 election. And that 4 years, between 80 and 84, is when he was able to get the patriation of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that we have today. So that's a pretty significant second act. The Charter and the patriation of the Constitution is one of those things that is still talked about to a significant degree. So that's a huge legacy. but also done after having lost an election. So it's a significant part of the Trudeau legacy coming after he seemed to be out of power for good, but it changed.
When Brian Mulroney leaves office, I think it was in 1993, he was a pretty unpopular politician. The percentages were some of the lowest percentages in the history.
Yeah, I think they still are.
Right. I think it was he was at 12%, I think it was. It seems, though, that over time, the way in which he's being assessed by Canadians has changed, because many historians now regard Mulroney's tenure as being one of the most successful periods for a prime minister of the 20th century.
It's a very interesting case, the case of Brian Mulroney. You're right, when he left office in 1993, he was one of the most unpopular prime ministers in Canadian history. And even in the years after he was in office, his reputation took a beating through various revelations of payments and
the Airbus scandal, for example.
The Airbus scandal, shady business dealings. But Mulroney always worked hard to resurrect his reputation. And as time goes on, I think people started to appreciate some of the bold initiatives that he took, and that he made courageous attempts at things like free trade. He had tremendous environmental legislation. He had excellent relations with the United States, and Canada was genuinely seemed to be heard on the world stage. And then when Brian Mulroney passed away 2 years ago in 2024, we saw a lot of outpouring of affection, I think, for a man who reached a lot of people on a personal basis through telephone calls and letters. He always paid attention to people. But also, I think people were respecting the boldness of the initiatives that he took. I think we want to see that in our leaders, someone who will throw some political risk or put some political capital on the table. And people appreciated the grandness of his initiatives when looking back at him now. So to me, one of the interesting things there is when we look at former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, another Prime Minister who was quite unpopular at the end of his time in office, how will he be remembered 30 years from now? And one other thing I might add on this about Mulroney, Adrian, is that we're still kind of early in the evaluation of the Mulroney years. Right now, it seems like it's pretty good, but there haven't really been a lot of history books on Brian Mulroney yet. Only a few that I could put my finger on. There's still, I think, a comprehensive record, a comprehensive evaluation of the Mulroney years is still to come, and hopefully one of those books will come soon. There have been a few, but we need a few more.
In this journey that you've been on, telling the story of Canadian prime ministers, what surprised you?
One thing I will say is that I was pleasantly surprised about how much material I was able to find on Indigenous history crossing the Prime Minister's desk. There was a lot more than I thought there was, and so it was easy to infuse my history with some stories about that history. Same with the environmental policy. When you start looking at issues that we're consumed with today, and then you see if there were earlier versions of this in the history books or in the primary source documents, you see that, in fact, they are there. But the other thing I would say is, and this doesn't surprise me, but I think it's something important to say, it's that Canadian prime ministers, they're there to do the best job that they can. And I take a very nonpartisan look, at least I feel it's a nonpartisan look at, it's not an unbiased look, but it's a nonpartisan look at our prime ministers. And I always say to people when I'm giving public lectures is that you may not like the policies or you may not like the person, and that's why we have elections. But I don't think we can deny that the 24 people who have served as prime minister have been genuinely trying to make the country a better place. None of these people were evil people or bad people. And it bothers me when people will try to portray someone, whether it's Sir John A. Macdonald, Brian Mulroney, Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau, when people try to portray them as bad people. They're not bad people. These are good people who may have done things that we don't appreciate. And so I think we've been lucky to have people in the Prime Minister's office doing the best that they can with all of their human foibles and trying to make the country a better place.
James, great to chat with you. Thanks so much for joining us on In Bed with the Elephant.
Yeah, my pleasure for the talk.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant, a production of Ricochet Media. Let us know what you think about our show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow the podcast on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever you find your podcasts. The producer, editor, and sound engineer of In Bed with the Elephant is Dave Sarazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music, Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Kaloran. I'm Adrian Harewood. See you next time.